which many of you have been regular attendees of, which is fantastic. And as you all know, we're into theme 4 of Indexing the Human, which is a year-long seminar series made and funded, following the large questions of from classification to a critical politics of transformation. This is the poster which we just printed that has all of the list of speakers for this 4th theme, and there are flyers which you're welcome to have. So the theme 4, which I mentioned before, is taking a set of questions around kinship and obligation and mutuality and ethics, which you might think are a strange set of terms to put together, but it emerges out of several debates really around what it means to be a person, what it means to be related to other people, and a whole series of critiques within sociology and anthropology about how we think about relatedness and kinship and ethical conduct within those kind of terms. So so before I get to Dania, let me just also mention to you that next week we have Professor Elizabeth Pavanelli coming to Stellenbosch, and it's very exciting to be able to have her here. And I've been talking about Elizabeth Pavanelli to many of you for a long time. There's a whole week's worth of activities, in fact, which we're about to advertise. She's spending the first couple of days of next week at UCT. There's the Monica Wilson annual lecture, which is on Tuesday, which everyone is welcome to attend. Monica Wilson was professor of anthropology at UCT for many years, and there's an annual lecture in her name. And then on Wednesday morning at UCT, there's a film screening with Professor Pavanelli's 2 recent films, which is also open to attend that on Wednesday morning. And then Thursday, she'll be here at Stellenbosch in this seminar, Thursday afternoon, so you're all welcome to come to that, and to the reading group, which usually follows the lecture of the seminar itself. You're all welcome to attend that at 3 o'clock. And then next Friday, there will be another film screening and discussion of a film at UWC, at the Center for Humanities Research. So all of those events are open, and you're welcome to participate in any of them or all of them. And we'll be organising transport from Stellenbosch. If anyone wants to join, they can go to UCT and then to UWC. And of course, you're all invited to participate in our Stellenbosch events. So that's very exciting. So today we have Dr. Dania Mupotsa from Wits University, which is very exciting for me because I've been following Dania's work for some time, and we've been talking over the years a little bit. Not enough though. And Dania's PhD recently finished in 2014 in African literature at Wits, and Dania recently started teaching in that department, and her work is on weddings in South Africa. So I'm so excited about the kinds of debates that you're going to be opening up, so I don't want to say too much more about it, but there's a reading group after the session at 3 o'clock, just next door, which you're all welcome to come to. Whether you've read the readings or not, you're welcome to attend. And so, yeah, we'll hand over. We've got about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll have about 45 minutes for discussion and question and answer. So, thanks very much.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Thomas, for this invitation. It's really generous and wonderful. I speak slowly and quietly. It's a very terrible combination. So I'll read, and I'll try to read attentively and slowly, and then occasionally speak, sort of rub against myself as I'm working through. So you will just sort of yell if I'm completely incoherent to you. Okay, so Women and Cattle is the title of the paper. And it's one I've been sort of romancing with myself for a number of years. And the text, literally the large portion of the text that I have to work with is one that I clicked delete on as I was doing the PhD, because I wasn't quite, I'm sort of working around how to address some of the questions. Well, not really how to address the questions, but sort of the form of argument that I want to make. But the questions I work through here or grapple through are central motivations around the entire project. And the PhD, as Thomas has told you, I looked at marriage rituals. It's called White Weddings intentionally, and so there's a range of assemblages around race, space, sex, gender, desire, the form, the narrative that I'm working through around what the rituals all do. But I have two main figures in the work. The first one is Black women, and the other one is the ritual. And I work through these figures as assemblages of sorts as I read a range of texts. And also what happens with these two figures is that they become temporal spatial. So you'll see in the abstract I referred to women as the topos. And part of it was that I was located in a research chair on the local, and I had to talk about space and social history in certain kinds of ways. But it's also sort of my own way of trying to attend to empirical, methodological, and intellectual questions. And so space, temporality become how I enter the conversation across the different kinds of texts that I examine, about different kinds of relations, about objects, orientations, attachments, wishes, failures, and disappointments, as I try to observe them. I began this work after my own experience of law and negotiations and the kinds of feelings that I articulated, and then the way people had feelings about weddings, other weddings, and trying to think densely and carefully about how people talk about all of those feelings and how people manage to sort of leap through different kinds of placements in narrativizing the experience or the marriage ritual or their entry and sort of exit into different parts of being placed in its practice. And then incidentally, I conclude my final chapter was called Against Love.
Mm-hmm.
The version of the paper I have comes in conversation with various other kinds I'm working on. And I want to, and the kinds of different material I work with, and the kinds of ways that people affect towards certain subjects, and then Lobola being one of the ones that people, their stomach does this, and they always have something and they can't quite articulate. And then they become quite simple in their narrative strategy of dealing with it, because it's one of those things that does that to the body. So I carry no radical attachment to any kind of ritual, but I care about careful reading, and I'm interested in the things that stick and why they stick. And of course, good romance or shit romances such as this one, and things that I think they're funny, and how people, and how those senses or sensibilities come to bear, and what it means to have sort of the figuring of subjects as such, and kind of this kind of visual economy is what I want to attend to. But I'm going to share with you two abstracts of papers I've been working literally in the same week alongside with, to give you a sense of the way I'm assembling the figures I'm working with. So the first one, the paper is titled Becoming Girl, Woman, Bride, and specifically here I look at bridal magazines, and I say, so Becoming Girl, Woman, Bride refers to the various positions and transformations of the bride. The girl and the bride, as related in Becoming Bride, are the site of intense socio-cultural investment and anxiety played in cultural texts such as bridal magazines. Specifically shoring up those in circulation in South Africa, that produce representations of Black women as brides. I conclude in this paper with an argument about the Black femme as a girly line of flight that produces our image of common sense, albeit with a different relation to visibility. In positioning the Black femme in relation to the image of common sense, I make gentle attempt to broaden readings of how images produce a range of identifications and disidentifications, particularly in relation to the image of the ideal bride. In Proper Sex, the other paper, I read the experience of Black women as brides in South and Southern Africa, and the bachelorette party is a new, scare quotes, ritual that shares structural and affective parallels with other rituals that Black women who have traditional and other marriage rituals that they pass through in the cumulative process of getting married. Proper sex refers to the privileging of heterosexual sex acts that have at least at the level of fantasy a procreative wish. And I'm interested in the possibilities of pleasure in this sex, but attend to it as exclusions, assumptions, and failures. The wedding ritual places Black women as a presence-absence, as the ritual is framed around the movement of women from one territorial plane to another. And making tea is the figuration that I offer in assembling these rituals to describe a process of territorialization that rhetorically acts out the desire to produce bride through the performance of sexuated linguistic boundaries. So when I speak of bride or women as topos in this paper, I signal those two to get the sense of how I'm playing around space and becoming. And so, for example, the bride is the Mupotsa avatar in the first paper, and then making tea becomes the temporal, sort of territorial process of becoming bride. Okay, so women and cattle extend these propositions, but I work through this film, and I'm interested here in flesh. So I will run out of time, I'm sure. So at that point, I'm going to rush through the thing. So considering the place of flesh in the relation between women and cattle around sort of how hair weaving deals with edible plants, with its I suggested with the group later on. So the psychic life of flesh, human and cattle to make structures of kinship. And in the previous titles, how women, I'm sort of beginning at the point of orientation, we're going into the process of becoming historical subjects, potentially by becoming bride. But it's a repetitive, cumulative, failing, aspirational attachment or process. So rather than potential of becoming status woman capital or status subject S, what I'm suggesting rather is that the space or the repetition repeats a process of a wish to enter the subject, liberal subjecthood of all brides, but actually through the movement between, there's no possibility, it's a cumulative process of failure, even if the attachment to being remains. And so thinking about how this visually gets played and who gets made as proper subject or proper human, but also what in actual fact are the boundaries of coherent difference, racial, sexual, otherwise that get produced, and that's sort of this broad assumption that I'm working with. And the narrative made in the wedding ritual, I suggest, does the work of closing the assumption of coherent boundary identity. Figured, for example, the Mupotsa getting dressed in process in song. And then, of course, sort of some forms of narrative closure made, but continuous failures of narrative closure, which is the part that's not sagging, but not really attached to some kind of potentially human subject. Okay, so I have woman and cattle, flesh, skin, technologies, ritual, corporeality, narrative, form, body, assembled, and in similar ways, Alexander Wahila's most recent book uses the term habeas viscus, the phrase, you shall have flesh, to think about genres of the human. And so this becomes an assemblage, a racial assemblage, a racializing assemblage. And if I think about Mupotsa avatars, becoming girl bride, making tea is similarly racializing, sexualizing assemblages, which for him, he says, in contrast, a racializing assemblage in contrast construes race not as a biological cultural classification, but as an socio-political processes that discipline humanity into full humans, not quite humans, and non-humans. Okay, so we have this film. I'm just going to show you some of you may have seen it, some of you may not. So this is the well, it's actually not playing. It's coming, sorry. This is the what is it called?
Speakers.
No, not the speakers, but the what do you call this thing? The preview.
Trailer.
But I'll do that. So it's fairly recent.
I think we have speakers.
I mean, it's not.
There's subtitles.
There's subtitles. You
Put the full volume on the computer.
So how do we get the volume up? Which computer is this? Is this Stephen?
Yeah, just press maybe mute.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have everything from bloodlines to romantic love to dinner. So it's all sort of in this film and form. So this film is relatively recent, 2013, touted by the Film Video Foundation of South Africa as our own modern day fairy tale, and as one reading of what modern romance has to offer Black women in the present's futures. We move with the premise of reading romance is informed by a set of ideals, wills, and wishes that hold the proper enactment of self and love as reaching a point of achievement in marriage, and that marriage rituals then perform and transmit these wishes in a set of powerful relations to questions of freedom. So I flag ritual for a moment, always. And there are multiple marriage rituals that don't read them I do not read them necessarily as cumulative towards the same sort of meanings, narratives, forms, although there are many layers upon which. But albeit I read it in the way that they really are cumulative. So people enter multiple. And narratively, they peak and trough in very similar places. I'm interested in the ways that ritual accumulates in Black women, often with easy breath and a dualism around the modern and traditional. And marriage practice in the wedding, my ritual of choice, is invested in making tradition. So all weddings are processes of inventing tradition and taking ideas about what tradition means as consumer objects to place or play a visual representation of itself. So it's invented and making tradition, pinching nostalgias of tradition into consumer good that makes us feel good, which in the white wedding ritual comes to be made proper by the notion of shared verbal agreement or a speech act in public that make ready the distinctions of not only what is proper, but also what is sanctioned as legitimate in relation to other roles of before marriage, but are also what rescues the wedding as a ritual, incidentally, the speech acts around what's proper, from the principle of it being a public trafficking in sex in public as it is. Romantic love saves marriage with notions of freedoms achieved and enacted by individuals in love and not obligation. Of course, when we presented with what popularly sits as contradiction or ambivalence around lobola and these concurrent rituals, and then we suddenly have to confront the potential that romantic love isn't necessarily or actually always saved as trafficking. And there are scholars who play with this ambivalence and reading Bible magazines that play the sort of trope of how to have your wedding, the white wedding, and they'll have your traditional wedding, and sort of the confessional structure that these magazines produce around how you collected all these objects to make a version of yourself, continuous with the etiquette manual and other kinds of texts that circulate, and the ways that they point the point of access for the bride and being. So the magazines play this ambivalence and they make it as though romantic love in sort of individual capacity of the bride captures both events, but there's an ambivalence that scholars of the wedding sort of, and I'm flagging here someone like Benita de Robillard, who says, well, it's not a seamless legitimization. And part of what I read, the discomfort there is around the question of where romantic love comes to play in relationship notion of new freedom. But this is a digression, as I say in my notes. So we have confessions about the wedding, how it's curated, how it accumulates the moment of producing perfect images of love, and the speech acts of consensus and the proper are made legitimate by the production of images, still and moving, and multiple that can display the perfection of the day. What these confessions also do is tell us that lobola, the cumulative process of negotiations between two sets of kin to make the marriage proper, spectacularly achieved when a bride price tied to but not usually actually exchanged in the actual currency of cattle of women is agreed upon. They tell us that in the present's futures, when in fact women can perhaps pay for their own lobola too is for my love. And this is a play that I have because when I went through lobola, I wrote about it for Mail and Guardian. The editor called the piece Lobola for My Love. She thought that was clever. So go with it. Okay. And then, of course, the way I read ritual, no ritual is ever achieved, or never, it aspires for a natural closure, but never quite achieves it. So wedding rituals, white and otherwise, do not signal a pure and simple entry for me, but rather a continuous, repetitive set of becoming symbolic material, cycling historical and temporal flirtations with the proper, but of course failures and suspensions. No wedding is ever perfect, except maybe even an image that are produced in particular, sort of rehearsing and performing this impossibility of becoming. But I say this is a digression. Right. So reading similar to texts like Fanny Freer's Lobola, but also these sort of texts that we see in bridal magazines, the Robelite says there's no easy marriage between the modern and the traditional, that consumer love, consumer freedom give us as a bargain deal. That these texts, the speech acts of love and marriage or pull towards, get interrupted by the faint images happening in the background. So it's these moments of the cattle emerging that are the sort of breaths and suspensions that I'm trying to work through. And in particular, so when I pose making tea as process, as ritual, the cattle emerge in much more interesting ways than sort of small breaths of interrupting the potential of the dream. They place them in the center of the scene. So rather than have the cattle with the cow in the middle and the two of them kissing, I would place them together in sort of an assembled image. The ritual places them in the center of the scene that forms the structure of kinship through language and the law, capital out, projected project and aspiration of difference, and the songs sung and spoken, different occasions than the ones in the image, sort of rhetorically perform the deep aspiration, but the different voices in chorus then kind of put together the suspended breaths of what is actually in ceremony and in gift exchange. And then the process of territory. Romantic or not, becoming bride, making tea, ritualizes the movement of women from one territorial claim to another, signal celebrated with easy identitarian notions of difference, extending to the narrative of post-present in South Africa as one of intimate freedom. So the film White Weddings in 2010 comes earlier. It's announced as the first of its kind in local filmmaking, recognized as following global trends in romantic comedy, narrative style and structure, emphasizing the agency of the bride to produce and manage the various wedding traditions. And the main drama of that film is played out through the tension between what they are to readers, the cultural expectations of white post-apartheid culture and black township tradition, with the latter winning at the end of the day in terms of the form of the narrative. Both sets of expectations deny the agency of the bride, as the wedding planner acts as a cultural translator between our bride Ayanda and her family and friends in his attempt to impart good taste upon her. And on the other hand, her mother has planned a big wedding in the location. And even at the hour when the lavish wedding at the Cape Grace was meant to begin, her mother and aunts are cooking in preparation for the wedding feast. Their traditions triumph in the end. In reality, the groom fails to make it because of the drama he encounters on the cross-country road trip. The disappointment, but not surprise, expressed by the wedding planner is read as his failure in imparting good taste and good time to the bride. African time, as it's usually said, as opposed to being on time, serves as an underlying metaphor for the relationship between these two sets of traditions, modern and traditional, and it appears that Africans exist in perpetual time lag. And then romance as a narrative plot can be then described, when I read this film and others, as a genre of action film, intensely, while the intensity of the need to survive played out by a series of dramatic pursuits, actions, pacifications, the compulsion to repeat, and an optimism that both plays out ambivalence and disavows complexity. The description certainly fits the box office hit Fanny Freer's Lobola, which, when it opened in movie theaters in March of 2 years ago, much like its predecessor, White Weddings, enthusiastically received. Both films suggesting a turn from the dramas from film critics of racialized oppression that have long featured African filmmaking toward the ordinary thing called love. Reviews of the film go further in their praise of the affair, about star-crossed lovers Fanny and Dinky, that they triumph over their pasts, their locations, and their racial, also made as cultural differences. The romantic comedy invites us to read their love, albeit through a dramatic and comedic narrative, as what the future might hold for us all in this place. While like the action film, the romantic comedy also tells us through love we can be saved. In the case of Fanny Freer's Lobola, the triumph of love across difference invites us to see the modern-day fairy tale as one that can save us all. We first meet Fanny at a bar where he's watching his brother Sorrel singing on stage, flanked by scantily clad women dressed in futuristic attire. Sorrel vigorously gyrating his hips and singing a song that repeats the lyrics doof, 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 was presented to us as the ideal man, our hero. Our protagonist is instead the anti-hero, against his leaner, better manicured and successful brother. While sipping his beer, Fanny notices the woman sitting next to him at the bar. He makes a joke mocking his brother, as he intimates that the irony that such an effeminate man, deeply concerned with appearances, would be considered the ideal man. So the woman's intrigued and she enters a flirtation with him, giving him the opportunity to offer her a drink. We see Fanny counting some green and brown notes, 10s and 20s, to purchase a drink for her. Following a short conversation, the couple leaves the bar together. However, once she sees his refurbished car, in animal print, parked next to a BMW, and face drops. Having spent all of his money on the one drink he bought him, he asks for the change to tip the parking attendant. And this is the final straw, as she rejects him and runs back to the bar. The disappointment in love is a sign of the larger disappointment that is Fanny's life. As an unemployed, unmarried man, he lives with his widowed mother and receives an allowance that he spends rescuing scrap in his father's garage. The pursuit to overcome all obstacles so that you are not alone is extended to the broader imagined community of the nation in this form, even while the script is explicitly romantic. The fulfillment of marriage is not just for Dinky and Fanny. It's also intended to sell us the notion of a healing, healed South Africa. Made explicit in the speech Fanny gives when he's forced to go on a date with a good Afrikaans Macy by his mother. And his brother prepares him in a pink shirt, gels his hair, and he reminds him to be the man and romantic. So Fanny gets to identify with this mode of masculinity, to achieve success in romance with a more appropriate partner. But of course, he then outs who he really is by showing this date, his garage, his junkyard gallery, as he calls it. And he talks to her about what he's most passionate about, which is his cars that he refurbishes. And she's quite unimpressed, and he feels pressure to explain himself. And he says, most cars see a car wreck as a bad thing, but it's not. It's the strongest part of the original car. It's the core that survived the accident. You need someone with enough patience, love, someone who cares enough to transform that wreck into a miracle. The miracle refers to in part as his recently gained confidence, both in himself and his passion, the result of his budding relationship with the more supportive Dinky. The miracle is also implied in the meta-narrative of the plot that wants us to see their love and its triumph as what the new South Africa can offer us all. This is made evident by the soundtrack, for example, which is exclusively composed by South African artists, and the producer in the film selected the music with the principal idea of selling sort of this South African story. He says it's exciting, represents the collection of diverse characters in the story, what happens with this Afrikaans guy and a Zulu girl, choosing the right music. Incidentally, the film is based upon a novel that was, when it was initially written, was not written about a Zulu character, but that becomes easy for us to recognize as South African. Okay. So a lot of the time in the text, we see travel between the, and the film was originally set up, it was written in sort of the scene of Pretoria, north of Gauteng, but it gets recaptured around more sort of the location and the suburb that you can more easily identify around the image of Johannesburg, although it's not named. Oh no, it is Pretoria, because we see the park at some point. So, but we see, play a short part, but we see Fanny driving through from the suburb through the gates to the location in his car, and its image of playing the different sort of the drive of the different places back and forth in his car. And while we see him gaze at a movie from one temporality to another, once in the township space, we see him being gazed back at by black residents, and they're staring at him in his animal print car. And as he becomes more confident in sort of navigating the space, he then goes back into the gaze, gets exchanged back and forth as he gains in his confidence in knowing the place. And they just sit still, actually, watching him back and forth as he does this. The men and women in tin shacks, father shops, bar stand, or sit still watching Fanny as he drives through this landscape. The crucial part of the township experience then is framed by the gaze of still black bodies watching the action unfold. Fanny and Dinky share their first kiss at the local Sanyama while dancing to Suki. After sharing a joyride with three young men who initially are afraid of, or he's afraid of, that they're going to rob him. And during the joyride, their bodies literally bounce as they surf through the streets, and we hear Jack Harrow's Kula Seke in the background. The song not only describes Fanny and his misunderstood aspirations, but bridges the gap of difference and performs the affinities that Dinky and the men from the township share with Fanny. And we have to hear it, but because we're not going to, but it was good to play the Gula's Eke, but sort of the lyrics, your old news, I come with your beats, you've waited, and look for something, your iced tea, I'm the blitz, your light beer, I'm spirits, you're the guy with the new fresh look, I'm the guy with textile pants, I watch you, you take looking looks, before continue, get the point. All right, so you think, yeah, I think the cooler is the need to run driving in a Peugeot 206, but, yes, technically. So the rapper singing Afrikaans, the background then comes to represent an aspiration for a hybrid form of identity through this personal transaction, that while working with the notion of bound racial and ethnic difference, identifies both the pool and the shared experience of socioeconomic abjection as character presented in sort of Jack Perrow's rap, who like finally is not the rich hero who sings in falsetto. Incidentally, Sarl sings in falsetto. Who is Anna's brother. So part of the initial drama begins then at Sarl's wedding when the photographer is taking a family portrait and looking at the balcony where the family is posing. The photographer has a perfect frame that includes Dinky and Fanny at the far left. As he leans forward to take a shot, the groom reaches for his cell phone and tries to subtly tell the photographer not to include the undesirable woman in the film his brother's arm, so then they get cut out. But early in the day, when he's picking Dinky up, we drawn to the image of her and sort of a desire for her. So it's his first visit to her home when he's collecting her. He can't find the street signs and parks on the main street waiting for her. She walks towards him and we see her walking slowly towards, and so sort of the camera draws us, well, straight to her breast, but towards her. In the shape of her body, her cleavage, her face, we stare directly and she smiles at us. Struck, like many of the viewers of the film, Fanny stutters, your breast is inquisitive. Then, I mean explicit. And then Dinky, who's cool and confident, tells him he needs to say exquisite. Her ability to translate on his behalf suggests that she's located both as object and subject of this process of sexual objectification, this kind of interpretive shift from a couple-oriented desire to the erotics of a scene of encounter, with the fantasy requires repositioning the desiring subject as a spectator, as well as a participant in a scene of desire, and suggests a kind of doubleness the subject must have in her relation to pursuing pleasure. The doubleness of identifying both with the desired object and the desired object made Dinky's position. And well, sort of gaze and operation for me is not only a doubleness, but multiple other kinds of gazes, as all of us get into the process. And so she's both him, her, but also all of us at once. But as Dinky is invited to view her desire, our desire for her, and Fanny's desire for her, much like we are meant to read her as desiring subject, desired object within a broader social and symbolic world. Fanny recognizing her as desirable for the first time, because prior to this, it's been a dare for him to ask out, by the way. Something, this surprises him, something that we are meant to identify with, the surprise of this moment. And then we take pleasure in the surprise, as she does, for being recognized. So the fantasy of love here then framed by the idea that his ability to overcome the prejudice of race, so this fantasy is where the place where the subject encounters herself, already negotiated in social. Let's see. Dania and Fanny's relationship faces its first major obstacle when Fanny takes Dinky to watch a Springbok match at Loftus Stadium, but of course all the sort of big nation images rugby happen in this film. In preparation, the couple paint and disguise their entire bodies in green and gold in order to mask their skin, and therefore sort of any kind of racial difference, if we can go as far as to support whatever they were fantasizing on. So however, their attempts are in vain as they are confronted with issues in the parking lot. Two car guards await them at the stadium and demand 40 rands of fee. Fanny does not have the money and dismisses them, so the men curse him and threaten to scratch the car once they leave, in Zulu. Dinky hears them and compromises the disguise as she protests to their threats and then reveals to the men that she is black. The conflict worsens once Dinky tells Fanny what the car guards intend to do to his car. So then there's a whole conflict and then the couple has to retreat. They don't even make it into the game, into the car, and then they get chased with a badge as the car gets vandalized. Once they arrive back at Fanny's garage, the couple frightened and emotional are drawn to each other in this moment here. And then we have the sort of the sex scene, so this sort of height of emotion. The section which follows shows the couple washing the face and body paint off one another, and their true skin is revealed underneath. They see each other in the nude. The intimacy in the scene has conquered the reality of racial and cultural difference. The painted bodies of our protagonists, to disguise the surface of the skin and therefore the sign of racial difference, are dressed as futuristic cyborgs, what we might identify as alien-like, both strange and familiar to us. And I quote here, "We recognize aliens on our screens, the green, almost flesh, the shape of the hair, the protruding eyes. We can doodle on a piece of paper and draw an alien, perhaps as if by magic. On the other hand, the absence and presence of the alien pushes us to recognize the limits of representation as that which exceeds our knowledge. There's always the possibility that we might not recognize an alien if we see one. Aliens may be alien to the very cultural imagination which allows them to appear as little green men. The figure of the alien reminds us that what is beyond the limits is subject to representation. Indeed, what is beyond the representation is also at the same time overrepresented. What is overrepresented and familiar in its very alienness cannot be reduced or found in such representational forms, and such a double and contradictory existence of aliens in and beyond representation invites us to ask questions about the very relationship between the categories of alien and human. The techniques available allow us to differentiate aliens and humans, how such techniques of differentiation serve to constitute the very category of the human, and to what extent does the familiarity of the alien involve for the designation of the beyond as that which is already contained within us." And the long quotation from Ahmed, who thinks about the ambivalent relationship between the human and the alien, and how it functions to define the boundaries of who we are in the very proximity, in the very intimacy of the relationship between alien slime and human skin. It's funny, he wipes the paint off his dinky, but flesh is revealed, and he recognizes her much like he does in the moment I talked earlier when she walks towards the car. As they see in each other's bodies, the flesh underneath or inside is revealed, and then move from distance to proximity. And this moment is the kind of moment that Simon would describe as a failed historicity. That is, a history that admits its own failure in grasping that which has been, as the impossibility of grasping the present. The recognition shared between Dinky and Fanny as a miracle of our post-colonial, post-apartheid, present resolves this failure in this kind of narrative form. So Dinky dreams of owning her own business, and she has a university degree, but despite this works as a dealer in a local casino. She has a rich ex-boyfriend, Mandla, who's been pursuing her since because he thinks he's the ideal man for her. And when he sees the two of them at the Chisanyama recording a scene, he approaches the father. I'm bringing the dramatic moment for it quite gently. This is a dramatic moment. So he's approached the father, as all of this is happening, to pay the Walla 14. And the father sees her single life as a failure, and then sees that there's a moment here to capture a proper subject, a proper, more appropriate partner for her. And he doesn't see this as a contradiction to love. So he thinks that if Mandela comes into her life, then this will help her achieve her goals, etc., etc. So she's resisting this narrative, believing that she can achieve her success on her own business, her own life, etc., etc. And she's been saving money so that she can get a loan to start her own business. So when her father accepts this lobola and recalibrates his entire existence, she's now in a position where she has to then take her savings to pay back Mandela's lobola. Right. And then we hear sort of the moment of tension in the film is brought to us when there's a contradiction between this love, that's romance that's happening, and this relation that's happening between Mandela and her father. We don't actually see any proper negotiations. So in this case, there's no uncle going to an uncle, and she has no awareness of it happening. And the only marker we see of it happening, and there's quite two different moments. When her father first meets Fanny, he thinks he's meeting a boyfriend, so he wears an animal print outfit. I mean, not animal, he wears animal skin for this meeting, as most people do when they meet their children's boyfriend. Which is in complete contradiction to when he has a negotiation with Mandela, where the two of them have a discussion and he gets a check, and it's a blank check. So there's an awkward, interesting play between those two, all mediated incidentally by the fact that the father then, as part of his new money, hires a Zimbabwean domestic worker and he starts this father flirtation. Okay, so we have these constraints of tradition presented to us, and part of going back, because I've stopped really talking. when he meets, when Dickie and her father have lunch to meet Fanny. And when Dickie planned it, she at this point they weren't exactly romantically involved. But she wants her father to stop complaining about her not having a boyfriend, so she invites him over. So the father presents himself wearing traditional Lulu attire, including headring, shield, spear, and half carry. And as he enters, Fanny enters, he appears shocked and displays hostility. And then he serves them tripe. So again, things that are normally unusual. Tripe. So as the genre does, many of the people are presented in sort of comedic, what's the word I use here? Wild trope. So the Dickie's father clad in eating animal guts. This kind of performance of then what it means for him to form a version of being. And then of course when they get to meet and talk, they start to do Zulu dance. So this over performance and sort of profound being in. Going to go quickly because now about 5 minutes. Okay, so think about my speculation about animals and women in ritual. Okay, the marriage ritual scene that lends itself to psychoanalytic reading for reasons I demonstrate, especially through the bride's relation to the mirror with the image. The good life, self-possession, property, propriety reinforce the process of image production that are made and kind of where the image projects images of self and narratives around attached to human vision representation. And of course, as I suggest also then, simultaneous to this trafficking, there's an intervention by Vicky Bell, which thinks about the passing of the hand, much like the passing of traffic, the hand to the groom, and says the scene is full of anxiety. So sliding off the glove without turning it inside out. What is it about the interior of the bride's glove that makes it seem unseemly at the marriage ceremony? Perhaps the interior of the glove is to be hidden in ceremony, but that is about the outward display of circulation, the circle of the wedding ring that displays the circulation, the gifting of women. The interiority disrupts an exchange between the men who are becoming linked through her, in which she is the exchange, the gifted, or maybe more simply, her movement would appear too keen, she just did this with her hand, to receive the ring and receive him. And if so, there is a loss of serenity. In short, it would not be very becoming, and says she has to take her time to sort of nervously say nobody will rush you. For taking the hand in marriage would be too monstrous, were she to turn herself by turning this glove into a double-handed creature. As if she had two right hands, the hand fleeting, cruelly demonstrating a monstrosity prior to the sacred signing of the bond and the band. And there's too much to say, which of course comes in contradistinction to the fact that in the wedding ritual speech acts that perform the sort of individual self-possessed subject of women entering marriage. I think about Dinky in the place, and I can't tell you the rest of this narrative, but she becomes this sort of savior of the day, and the savior of the process, and also the savior of finding in terms of getting, for him getting wealth and money and an ability to pay the Lola, which they eventually don't pay. So think of her as a kind of figure that sits around the category of sort of this vibe of bothness, the doubleness, sort of two right hands, so to say. She was become this figure in the register of humanism that I'm provoking around the kind of edible hex that proposes. At which point, then I want to then think about flesh. And the kind of potential monstrous connection between this kind of subject who performs without saying much at all, but also saying too much. I'm like jumping between 25 pages. How do we want to conclude? Yes, I conclude because it's 5 pages, and I'm trying to summarize them in 5 sentences and say them dramatically. And then we can have a discussion on it and make clear. Okay, thank you.
No, thanks very much. And people have something about to leave. There's always the excess of the image and what wants to be said, what needs to be said, and so we just work with what we have. And you've given us a fabulous amount to buy into. So why don't we take a couple of questions at a time, and we can open up the discussion and see where it goes, and I've got some questions, and I'll come back for now. So let's start with Michelle, and then are there others already who want to throw their hat in the ring? Okay, let's start with Michelle. See how we go. Yeah.
No, I think I think there's a lot to think with. I just have to go back to what you started with, which was saying that when you concluded your PhD, the title of your conclusion was Against Love. So I'd like you to please elaborate on that and perhaps link that to this.
Yes, go for it. Okay. When I did, well, part of it was the way love gets attached to potential. I think anyone could be self-possessed in relation to, so anyone could have a relation of love and still be self-possessed, which makes sense that if love is invented around, or romantic love spreads and becomes sort of meaningful as a universal, around the same time as sort of a consumer revolution, around sort of time as a domestic revolution, around sort of the time as when companionate marriage marks a two-in-one intimacy that's somehow distinct from other forms of intimacy that would presumably previously have nothing to do with the social obligations. So part of it is was initial resistance to that narrative of signaling love as freedom, because that's not right. But part of it also, so part of it is thinking about the attachments to love and how they repeat violent compulsions. So the body of the bride depleting itself to become bride inactive. So part of it is and then part of it is thinking about love as a narrative form of art and how it assumes closure at certain moments of happiness, and then my refusal of that. And then maybe that's one of it. Part of it is that. Part of it is that. Yeah. So part of it is my sort of refusal to see the kinds of distinctions people make about potential human subjects if love is made, if love is present. The idea that, it's also the idea that any kind of form of relation can potentially be bearable. And I'm suggesting that all forms of relation are completely unbearable. I don't know that, yeah.
So then can we take up this provocation? They're all forms of relation are unbearable. Well, how is it that some relations are made bearable? If we take a kind of matter of fact, well, we see that relations are borne up, as it were. By what means are they made bearable, if at all? In tension with the claim that all relations are unbearable.
By optimism, that I'm different from everybody else, which is fine, but it's, for sure.
Yeah.
we may all. Yeah.
That was here the second part of Michelle's question.
Yeah.
On the relation to
the cattle.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So yeah. So okay. But if I think of how I was trying to answer the same question but differently in relation to like how excited people get for marital sex or not, but in the planning what you know to. So there's an optimism. And there's all sorts of excitement and all sorts of narrative forms around that, things that make us happy. And there's not that there's no enjoyment in relating to others, or becoming beautiful, or being the center of attention, or so that there's enjoyment, there's pleasure, but there, I guess what for me then, if I think about it, and the way I wanted to think about it is as ways sort of the assumptions we make around an equation. So in a math equation, when we say this plus this, or this plus x is 5, and then you specifically how both use group theory. So this plus x equals 5, and then we make certain assumptions around how we calculate x. So there are a range of assumptions about what that group means that help us answer the question of x. So part of what for me makes it most unbearable is when I think about what the assumptions are. So part of those assumptions that get made into meaning, which we have optimistic meaning about, are how we have sex, who we have sex with, why we have sex with them. What it means to have properly real, those kind of things, which are all played out in the marriage law, because it plays the public act. You wait for the moment The people kiss and then we know they're going to their bedroom. And we're so excited and we watch it in public and we feel emotions and we cry about it and we feel like, oh, what great friends we are. And for watching this moment happen with a set of assumptions around what that means. So part of what I'm trying to do is think about the assumptions that we would make to calculate X and then unravel them. Because for me, there's an attachment to the assumptions. And it makes sense to have an attachment because people do read them as potentially free. So we so being able to consume, being able to be seen to be an individual, to articulate a beautiful version of yourself, to be represented as an image. So when I think of magazines that would never have had a black bride and now you have lots of them, what does it mean as thinking around questions of representation and being seen in an image? So that's part of it. And I see attachment optimism around that part. At the same time, then it's like, well, then what? Or, you know, so, and it's also, I mean, pretty much the ritual, and then what? You finish and you're broke and you're sad and you're disappointed. And of course, so, and for me, disappointment is actually the drive for desire rather than aspiration. And that's sort of one of the sort of things I thought on that. So it's actually the drive, so being disappointed is the compulsion of repetition. This romantic comedy structure for me doesn't work in comparison to other texts. Lots of things, texts that come up in television, for example, which will do romance novel, and part of the videos you saw, it's a short web series that's filmed in Dania that I taught in a public reading course. So where people write about African rom-com and paperback as not having the same narrative arc, so people don't end happily ever after, much like this film. So this kind of optimism. So the guy actually turns out to have robbed you and leaves you with a child, and then you don't get married, and then you sit with your friends, and you're like, at least I have my friends, and that's a different kind of romance. And so part of also reading those competitive narrative forms, which repeat disappointment differently and repeat optimism differently, and trying to read them, rub them with each other around why, when I'm sitting, you know, brides or sort of why certain kinds of narratives repeat. So yes, I'm going to become a bride who has proper sex with my husband and procreative, but the same person is like, let's dry hump, you know, and metaphorically and sometimes not, you know. So without reading dialectically, I think that's what I'm saying. Rather than read them as in oppositional dialectically, how do they read? How do they expose different sets of assumptions around something that we all recognize and would read as the same as the narrative? I don't know if that's helpful. It makes any sense in relation to the question.
I just want to ask, what do you think about culture as we know it? I mean, it is a social norm, social construction. But I mean, what about culture? Getting married culturally, in a cultural way. The other fanfare of just going to a house. I mean, does that place an unnecessary burden on the woman, especially the woman? Because as men, you are a little bit excused there, but for like, if the lady, like you both are a bit young and you still want to start, you still want to travel, but then the cultural norm comes in that the lady actually needs to get a baby. So how do you defend your own wife, which you married culturally, against those little taboo little things which actually comes into play? Because a cultural marriage, I'm going through one now, and it is actually very, very tough, especially on the lady.
Yeah, so I guess this is some of what I'm, because the bride in this case would be, part of it is like, well, you have obligations to become a bride and a wife, right? And there are expectations, and it feels like a sudden change because your life wasn't anything that you were able to do so many other kinds of things prior to the moment of becoming a bride. And so then there's a shift in terms of the expectations, which don't necessarily happen to the groom. I was talking to friends who got engaged, and she was telling me about Say Yes to the Dress, which is when you say yes to a dress show. And when I make the argument that the groom, I don't even know what to do with the man figure, short of like some grooms who sit with me, because not only is this visual there, but all of it can happen without literally physically being there. To the point where you can say yes to the dress, much like you can say to people. So the enactment of the ritual doesn't need you. It doesn't need you because that's not what it's meant to perform. It doesn't need you as a relation because it centers. And of course, then the assumption is a change of status for the woman in terms of expectations. Right? And so a lot of the times the expectations are verbally. So you become bride and people tell you all the changes, and they sing and they make babies. I'm interested in when I'm listening to people at parties performing that, for example, the advice and the suggestions and people's expectations to follow through, for example. It often comes in contradiction to a version of a person's prior self where they felt free to be and do other things. And then this becomes this, and that's kind of what I'm sitting at. I'm trying to understand how people may take up different options. Sometimes people will say will repeat things that fit into the cultural norm or are neat, but the way they act doesn't fit. So there's no stable response. So part of what I'm trying to think is, well, what do I do with that? And with that, what I do with that, relying on the idea that even if you didn't get married, if you were free and single, that life would be better. Because if that was the case, why are people so desperately attached to the idea of eventually getting married? And vice versa, and otherwise. Yeah, I don't know that's. And also keeping in mind that any kind of cultural marriage is always a process of negotiating and inventing and nostalgia for an idea. So even in the negotiations, if families when you watch, and I watch families negotiate, what's more important is the person who's right. It doesn't matter, there's no original, everyone's just really interested in being correct, even if they're making it up along the way. And so I'm interested in the kinds of cultural differences that get performed rather than that there's a culture that was there before the confrontation, which a film like this then plays out. And then we all attach because it's familiar.
Yeah, do you want to add on to that?
Yeah, just on the subject of culture, and I'd like to take this further, maybe with parents. I need to confess that I'm one of those guys who actually lives in the corner and have a degree. But I'd like you to speak more about this intersection between culture and appearance, especially in the light of this industry that seems to be emerging. We have like new job titles like wedding planners, people who are spending a lot of money, who earn lots of money from planning things. And of course, you have this channel on DSTV, and a kind of false image, a false illusion that is sent to prospective marriage partners as wanting to push the bar even further and further, because people are now focusing more on traditional marriage partners, now focusing on how much to spend, the kind of standards that have been created through television. Would you like to say something more about that intersection? Are we seeing the decline of tradition? Are we going to be seeing more perfection of these rituals? Or how is this going to really change this notion of how we conduct marriage, especially in the South African context?
Yeah, so the way I think about it historically, very same ways. Simultaneous to this, I read how often when traditional marriage is read historically, there's an assumption that there's an originary form, which we have an attachment to an idea of an originary form. And in fact, when you look at, and so part of what I've done, and someone who does this much more intensely is someone like Mupotsa who looks in KZN at the introduction of customary, various codes of customary, but so customary law, common law, and so part of what that does is part of the invention of those laws, which attach to, for example, categories of lobola and the assumptions around how it changes with the introduction of capital. And some of the easy ways people assume that cattle for cash and that transition changes the meaning and then devalues some kind of originary relation. And of course, it's always relational, whether it's a 10 rand note or a cow, there's a relation whether it's cash or not. I think part of I think it's important to think about the originary assumptions, and a lot of it has to do around the assumption that one is an assumption of of authenticity, which we can move from. There's an assumption of the stability of ways that people are sexed and gendered and related through kin structures, which attaches itself to historically the way the ritual has been read and understood. And then, of course, there's an assumption that there's a difference between tradition and capital, which makes a trouble. And as I would begin by, I would problematize all of those to begin with. Part of what the wedding industry does, and if I point to the wedding industry as an industry we recognize in the last 20 years in a particular way in South Africa, but in a broad sense, the wedding planner, or people who have coherent businesses around selling all the objects in one place, and that's around 20 years. The venue that has the, you can buy the priest and the photographer all in the same place as the ground. You can move from the lobola hall to the, wedding, as different venues play different times and places. It consumerizes, makes it more of a consumer object, I don't know, you can get someone who can write your lobola contract for you, but of course the lobola contract is often written, it's one of the earliest written sort of forms, and people will sit there and write the letter to send and write the letter. So I'm not attached to some kind of a nostalgia for purity of form. I'm interested in the continuities. I think, I think what's interesting about those people who market the wedding, our perfect wedding, one, well, to give me lots of material to look at until I'm done with this, which hopefully soon. But they expose the extent to which every set of interactions between families is mediated immediately and invented immediately, and they suspend any potential wish that there's an authentic past. Each interaction exposes, and even when people say, "Oh, but if you remember, but immediately," and I think that's really interesting and productive. And I don't see a contradiction. I don't see a falsehood. That's really, I don't see a falsehood at any point. Yeah, I lost part of the sentence in the question, but it's okay.
Let's take a few more questions and then we'll come back. Gugu has one, and Rob and Joanna. Should we take all three and then we see where that takes us? Yeah.
I'm curious how you compare some other sexual exchanges, like cohabitation, to the kind of matrix that you talk about of marriage. Is your disenchantment locatable in the notion of the commodification of women and the issue of value, the issue of flesh and care that you talk about? Would you consider such forms such as cohabitation liberating, and what types of value in sexual exchanges would you see as different in those types of union which do not fall within this type of a public ritualization of sex, but in which we still know that there are certain sexual exchanges that go on?
John,
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. It was really interesting. I was just wondering if you could say something about heteronormativity, because it's kind of sort of dancing around the edges a little bit of what you said. And I was just thinking about questions of heteronormativity in the way the film is constructed, and also in relation to what you wrote in the PhD.
Yeah, so thanks for a fantastic presentation. I thought it was really funny as well, actually. And around humour, I mean, you talked a little bit about the genre being a kind of comedic kind of genre, but I wonder if you could say something about how that relates to the topic. And I mean, I was thinking, one of the things that struck me was when a lot of times that the issue of cross-racial relations are addressed, whether the sexual relations or even non-sexual relations, is often in the form of humour. I mean, adverts and things often play around, with kind of showing black and white people in humorous kind of situations, and it seemed that when you were kind of talking about humour, the examples you gave were very much ones which kind of played about and reinforced, quite kind of racialized constructions of culture and modernity, etc., and also created a kind of false optimism using kind of stereotypes of gender stereotypes, of women as kind of objects and playing around with those, and it's in relation to this, other bits, and I haven't seen the movie at all, but other bits in it where humour subverts these these kind of polarities, or does it always kind of reinforce them?
Yeah, I mean, there's very passive version in the songs. I mean, I think it would have to be an interpretive act. So, for example, the eating of one of the scenes when the father's eating tripe and then dressed in the, I don't know, in the costume. But I think a lot of that in relation to Elwani, which is a film that came out 2 years ago, also the full feature film into Venda. And there's a scene, also, the drama's also around the marriage of the woman. So she comes home from Fritz and then to Venda, and Venda's like this mystical, timeless place when you arrive at it. And there's a whole 5-minute scene when the emissaries from the king are sent to tell her to negotiate with the family because she has to marry the king because of something that was sort of determined. And she's refusing to marry the king because she's in love with her boyfriend from Fritz and has scholarship to go to the US. And so in the scene, you see the camera sits right here, and then these men are eating chicken, and you see the chicken go from mouth to mouth, and it's about 10 minutes of just like, so you really get the sense that they're eating it. And the family's poor, so these are all of their chickens. So you see the one chicken, that chicken being killed, while these men are waiting for the father to agree for the negotiations to proceed. So when I think of those two connections and what that scene potentially does, it doesn't do. and so I think, well, of the possibility of analytically, interpretively thinking about flesh, for example, the eating of flesh and the moving of flesh and sort of killing of flesh in relation to this kind of where I'm trying to work through at the end of this paper as subversions, but the humor very much makes it easier to deal with things that I would otherwise not be able to say out loud between them. So which is why they become these massive caricatures. At the end, at the end of the film, but even in their dress, I mean, even her dress is ridiculous, and she's because everyone is ridiculous except except for our protagonist, and even finding himself until Dinky saves him is a ridiculous version of everything. It's literally the cow and Dinky that save everyone. Mandla, the Zimbabwe, the best, everyone is ridiculous and so then besides thinking of the optimistic attachment to her, and then I think in general also about the way that Black women get figured as optimistic attachment for South Africa's aspiration of itself in and of itself. What other ways does she, and that's why I gave that sort of handed out the Antigone's claim, if I think about her and the kind of subject that, because she's not funny at all actually, she's serious, she analyzes things, she's very clever, so in what way? So that's part of it. It's also part how humor works around this question of question that came before around heteronormativity. So for me, I retain the category white wedding, and I retain it in terms of my analysis across genres of wedding practice and ritual, because I see all of these rituals as white wedding processes, and all of the people who fail at them as queer subjects in their failure. So there's a straight line, to use Ahmed's notion, around which these rituals produce idea of a coherent subject, potentially who's proper. And the ways, the suspensions, the failures, the moments that I look at that fail to capture the straight line, whether the subjects do heterosexual sex or not. So even when I look at people talking, narrativizing sex acts that are procreative and heterosexual, the suspensions and threats and the other things that happen at the ritual that suspend the straight line. So heteronormativity is part of the narrative arc for aspiration. But the way that desire retains and works for me. So whether heterosexual or not, and that's part of why I read the weddings that I do very keenly across people who read the arguments around gay marriage, very much around liberal legal framing, inclusion. What does the wedding do in relation to the marriage? Because marriage and weddings are different. The wedding performs a ritualized act in public towards an aspiration for a straight line, historically across the board, in public. So you get to be a certain kind of proper subject, recognizable by your community in certain kinds of ways. But it's different from the wedding itself, which then presumably is the site for the relation of a communal self relation to others. So then when I think about the white wedding as a whitening performance, a whitening ritual, as you have argued, then the scene here then is interesting, if albeit funny, in terms of what it tries to do to that ritual as a practice. Okay. Liberating. What forms of cohabitation, living, sexing are liberating? All of them, none of them. So part of it is thinking about sort of the broad the scholarship in sort of in the negativity school, right? So part of it I'm thinking like along those lines. So there are pleasures and enjoyments even in the most sort of radically horrible, horrifying scenes, places. I struggle to, so I conclude sometimes. So when I think about, if I watch scene or recount sort of a range of scenes, and I think about the times someone I was talking to, PhD student in my department, and he said, when you write about that, or some things I won't say out loud that I've observed, that I exceed the straight line. So I'm at a bachelor party, and I'll say now, so the one who's speaking in particular, so there's all this like straight line stuff, there's, you know, do this for your husband, da 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 da, and then, you know, and there's all the sort of straight line, procreate, da 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 stuff. But the minute everyone gets drunk, people start kissing and making out with each other, da 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 da. And part of me not talking about it is me thinking cautiously about meaning making, but also the kind of ways that, because I have access to all sorts of spaces, and I want to think carefully about how I write about the places that I am as a person, thinking, reading, and how I write about them and the kind of sensation that they produce by writing, but also because of the levels of narrative that people articulate versions of themselves, and how to, so I wouldn't say it's liberating, because it may be just as liberating to like, what is, you know, stuff that happens after the line. Maybe just as interesting, just as terrible as the stuff that happens, you know, in the most in boring missionary position sex with your husband. It may be just as wonderful and as terrible. So I'm not ascribing a value of liberation or otherwise, but I'm thinking about the ways people do narrativize values, like through those terms, and how they attach to other kinds of language. I don't know if that's, yeah. I don't know.
So what I find really stimulating about your paper is the way in which you're forcing us to think about an economy of images in ways that challenge quite conventional ways of thinking about dried wealth and traffic in women. So there's something quite powerful about saying there's an aesthetic dimension, there are images that are in circulation, and we can talk about subjects and their desire in relation to something called culture, in quotation marks, and all the kind of, what should we say, like materialist and political economic readings of women and cattle in Southern Africa. So it's quite a radical confrontation that you're giving us, which is fabulous. And earlier on in the talk, you offered us a formulation of see if I get this right, about the desire for a perfect, how should we say, a perfect wedding, a perfect rendering, a perfect, some kind of achievement, which is impossible, partly because there's something to do with the speech act, the spoken dimension of it, which reaches for some kind of perfection, but necessarily fails. And so I'm interested, so you've set up this possibility that we can think about customary marriage and lobola specifically in relation to speech acts and some kind of performativity theory. Fantastic, great. Okay, but does that now mean that we're firmly only in a domain of images and the material and the political economic somehow are mere, they so old-fashioned, right? And in a way, that's what I'm hearing some of the questions are asking for as well. How do we think about this? How do we put the aesthetic, the performative, and the speech dimension alongside a range of other registers in which all of this is somehow coming together? So that's the sort of one part of it. I'll come back for a second part.
Depends which material. I mean,
Yeah.
for example, even just and I don't get to this. I mean, even the body of. So there's lots of ways that visually or aesthetically the bride has to become, but it's the body. So so it's so many. We don't see Dinky eat once in this film, by the way. But which mirrors a lot. So to be an ideal, but the extent to which so no person looks like they look like on their wedding. I've never seen a person who looks like they. Well, I know there's one person I know actually, but so the fact that the body goes through a process of becoming, doesn't ever achieve it. Very few of us can look like the ideal, right? So part of it is being with people and watching people, and myself too, like watching the body change in this process. So recognizing it as a material process of different kinds, related to images, certainly. That's it, the ideal. But what does it mean to think really about the body as a machine in this sense? I'm interested in the kind of eating scenes. And there's one section that I never finished, which is like this fat black woman in the mind's eye. So, the flesh and the fat, usually eating tripe and fat, the way that gets marked onto, even when we don't see it in psychosocial material, historic readings or renderings of how we distinguish between past, present, tradition, otherwise, etc., etc. So for me, the material manifests in bodies that do, that smell, that leak, that pour out. Some of them end up being real. Some of them, it's one thing since women sells bridal sex toys, and one of them's called Come Clean. And to clean your sheets afterwards, and nobody knows what happened, in case you can't wash them. And for me, then I think about, how do I think a lot of things, but then it goes to the sheets in the domestic space. So the kind of making of space, and so the partitioning of space, the ordering of space around the aspiration to be proper, to make the body proper, to contain, and so the body becomes one of the material sides. When I think about one of the questions in an inverse way that I get asked about, well, if you read weddings, the majority of people can't actually afford to have a wedding or even go through the lobola process. So how does it come to matter? And I think about the range of, and so many of my conversations aren't with people who are actually in the status of bride. So it's a range of ongoing conversations. So part of it is the extent to which the form takes up the relation to becoming women in general and intimates so many genres of the popular and the immediate, and the kinds of images making that it produces a relation to. So part of it is that, part of it is also all things that fall outside of the proper enactment of marriage, cohabitation, and that, for me, don't necessarily mean that the ritual or the assumption of an initiation go away. So I'm interested, so when I talk about the girl and the bride I'm interested in sex education or the text of it, or what it means to buy tampons in the very same relation materially. So it just becomes a text space for me to think about where I can really sit with what people think of and produce as the proper material, how it visually captures in relation to being outside of the straight line. So in that sense, I don't know. That's what I feel like my brain started.
Is that a good place for us to stop? Any more questions? You want to ask one more question before we wrap it up? I think we should pause there before we go into the reading group phase, but just wanted to say thanks very much for a very wonderful play, very complex and very rich. So You've really added to our discussion here at Stellenbosch and indexing the human. So I'm hoping that we can think a bit more about the material given us in the reading group, but also afterwards. Thanks very much.